The Vulcan Admiral Linux laughed in Scott's face. "Your pathetic human fleet is nothing compared to the might of the Vulcan Imperium. You are like insects to us. We will crush you." The view screen filled with the immense form of the Kralnor, Admiral Linux's dreadnought. It hung in space like a giant predator, bristling with enough firepower to glass a planet. Next to it, the UES Indomitable looked like a toy. A distress call crackled over the comms. "This is the Arcturan colony of New Hope. We are under attack. Vulcan forces are invading. They're slaughtering civilians. Please, if anyone can hear this, help us." Scott Shaw, grizzled veteran of the Sol Rebellions and captain of the Indomitable, stood on his bridge and clenched his fists until his knuckles went white. He knew all too well what the Vulcans did to those who defied them, the burnt-out ruins and mountains of skulls they left behind. "Admiral Linux, this is Captain Scott Shaw of the United Earth ship Indomitable. Break off your attack immediately or we will be forced to engage." Linux's cruel laughter echoed through the bridge. "You cannot be serious, human. I have a single battery that could vaporize your entire fleet. I could swat you aside without even slowing down. I will enjoy picking your bones from my teeth. All ships, forward." The Kralnor surged towards New Hope, disgorging waves of attack craft and troop landers as it came. Scott had seen enough. "Battle stations! All hands to battle stations! Prepare for combat!" Alarm klaxons blared and the Indomitable's crew scrambled to their posts. Scott keyed the shipwide comms. "I know we're outgunned. I know the odds are against us, but we're the only thing standing between the Vulcans and the colony. We're the only hope they have." He slammed his fist on the arm of the command chair. "The Vulcans think they can push around whoever they want. They think the galaxy belongs to them, but they've never fought humans before. They're about to learn that we don't back down, no matter the odds. We'll show them what happens when you piss off the wrong species." Ragged cheers sounded through the bridge. Humans and allied aliens alike shouted their support. They knew this was likely a suicide mission. The Indomitable couldn't hope to beat the Vulcan fleet head-on, but Scott had a plan. A desperate, crazy plan that only a human would even consider. It would likely get them all killed, but if it worked, it might just give the colonists a fighting chance. The lives of 15,000 innocent civilians depended on it, and the Indomitable wasn't about to let them down, even if they had to fight to the last man. "Helmsman, set an intercept course full speed. We'll hit them with everything we've got. Let's show them what humans are made of. All ships, attack." The Indomitable, flanked by its small fleet of escorts and fighters, burned hard towards the oncoming Vulcan armada, weapons powered and loaded. This was humanity's chance to bloody the Vulcan's nose and show the galaxy that even the smallest of foes could be a deadly threat if pushed too far. Now they would see what a few humans could do against impossible odds with their backs to the wall. The Vulcans were about to learn that there were worse things to fight than massive fleets and terrible weapons, worse things than monsters and nightmares. They were about to fight humans, and may God have mercy on them all. The Indomitable dropped out of warp at the besieged Arcturan colony of New Hope. Scott Shaw and his crew were horrified to see the massive form of the Vulcan dreadnought Kralnor looming over the planet, its weapons already raining destruction on the surface. The colony's orbital defenses were buckling under the onslaught, and panicked distress calls flooded the comm channels as terrified civilians begged for salvation. Scott didn't hesitate. "All batteries, open fire, target their main guns. We need to pull their attention off the colony." The Indomitable's advanced human weapons lanced out, slashing through the Vulcan shields like they were paper. Explosions blossomed along the dreadnought's hull as beam cannons and missile batteries took hit after hit. On the Kralnor's bridge, Admiral Linux roared in outrage as damage reports flooded in. "Return fire! Crush that impudent speck!" The two mighty warships wheeled to face each other, trading thunderous volleys of cannon fire. The human ship was far nimbler, dancing around the lumbering Vulcan vessel. Scott and his crew wove a deadly path through the orbital dockyards and space elevators, using the structures as cover. The dreadnought's gigantic guns couldn't track the smaller ship through the obstacles. Linux pounded his command chair in frustration. realizing he had severely underestimated these humans. "Signal the fleet. I want reinforcements. Now." Space rippled as 3 more Vulcan warships dropped out of warp, quickly moving to flank the Indomitable. Scott cursed under his breath. Even with their skill and technology, they couldn't beat those odds head-on. But Scott Shaw had not earned his reputation by doing the expected. "Helm, lay in a course through that asteroid field." The helmsman, an Andorian with reflexes like lightning, nodded sharply. "Aye, Captain." The Indomitable veered away, engines flaring as it raced towards the dense field of rocks. The Vulcan ships pursued, closing in like hounds around a wounded fox. They thought they had the humans cornered. Scott allowed himself a tight smile. "Let's see how they like this. All-point defense batteries fire at will. Slag those rocks." The Indomitable's guns erupted, filling space with criss-crossing beams of coherent light. Asteroids shattered under the barrage, filling the void with an expanding cloud of razor-sharp fragments. The Vulcan ships plowed straight into the storm of debris. Shields flared and popped as the Vulcan formation was engulfed. Sensors registered one ship breaking apart. Its hull breached in a dozen places. Another reeled away, leaking atmosphere and trailing debris. The Kralnor pushed through, its heavier armor letting it shrug off the worst of the damage. Linux snarled his fury to the stars. No lowly human was going to best him. "All ships close on that vermin's flanks. We'll tear it apart with our bare hands if we have to." As the Vulcan warships closed in, weapons primed, the Indomitable's lights suddenly winked out one by one. The human ship hung dead in space, engines cold, not a flicker of power to be seen. On the Vulcan bridge, Admiral Linux leaned forward, eyes narrowed. "What trickery is this? Scan them!" he barked, but the sensor officer shook his head. "No life signs, no reactor output. They're just dead, sir." A slow, cruel smile spread across Linux's face. "So the great Captain Shaw has finally met his match. Move in and finish them off. Let the galaxy see what happens to those who defy the Vulcan Imperium." The Vulcan ships glided forward, weapons locks echoing through their halls. Their targeting systems centered on the lifeless human vessel, ready to reduce it to glowing slag. But in that moment, just as the Vulcans entered optimal firing range, the Indomitable erupted with light. It was blinding, searing, a flash that seemed to consume the very fabric of space itself. The EMP burst washed over the Vulcan ships like a tidal wave, sparks cascading through their hulls as consoles exploded and lights went dark. On the Kralnor's bridge, Linux roared in fury as his displays flickered and died, the acrid tang of burning circuits filling the air. "Report. Main power is offline. Shields, weapons, engines, all non-responsive." The Admiral slammed his fist into his chair. "Get me backup power, and where are my reinforcements?" But it was too late. The Indomitable surged forward, power restored, weapons already thrumming with charge. Its hull shimmered and parted as boarding pods erupted from launch bays, rocketing towards the stricken Vulcan ships. Scott stood in the lead pod, encased in a hulking exoskeleton that amplified his every move. His Marines checked their plasma rifles, faces grim beneath polarized visors. "All right, people, we trained for this. We get in there, secure the bridge, and force that bastard Linux to stand down. And if he won't see reason, well, we'll just have to remove him from the equation." "Ura?" "Ura," his Marines chorused, the pod shaking around them as it slammed into the Kralnor's hull, burning through the thick armor in seconds. The pod door blasted open, and the humans poured out, plasma rifles already spitting blue fire. Vulcan crew rushed to meet them, energy blades glowing, but they were no match for the humans' ferocity and advanced tech. Scott led the charge, his exoskeleton-enhanced strength letting him toss Vulcans aside like ragdolls. Deck by deck they fought, leaving a trail of smoking Vulcan bodies in their wake. Every inch was paid for in blood and sweat, but the humans would not be denied. At last, they reached the bridge doors, scorched and dented from the furious firefight. Scott kicked them open, striding onto the bridge like an avenging angel. Linux whirled to face him, face a mask of hate and disbelief. You think you've won, human? You think your little tricks will save you? I still have a dozen ships on the way. In minutes your pitiful quest will be nothing but a memory. Scott tossed his rifle aside, exoskeleton whirring as he stepped forward. I'm giving you one chance, Linux. Surrender. End this now before more lives are lost. The Vulcan laughed, a harsh and bitter sound. Surrender? To you I would rather die than bow to an inferior species. We're not inferior, Linux. We're just different. Humans, Vulcans, we all want the same things. To expand, to explore, to secure our futures. But we don't have to do it like this, through slaughter and conquest. Linux drew his blade, the energy crackling along its length. You understand nothing, human. This galaxy is ours by right and by might. I will never yield to your kind. Scott sighed, dropping into a combat stance as his own energy blade extended from his exoskeleton's gauntlet. Then you give me no choice. They came together in a clash of blades and wills, human strength against Vulcan ferocity. The bridge became their arena as consoles sparked and emergency lights flickered. But even as Scott pressed his advantage, alarms blared throughout the ship. The sensor officer, hunched over a flickering display, shouted over the din, "Sir, Vulcan ships dropping out of warp. I count 15 signatures." Scott felt a chill run down his spine, even as he parried Linux's frenzied strikes. A Vulcan fleet that size could reduce the Indomitable to atoms, along with the colony below. And with their own ship crippled and their boarding teams scattered through the Vulcan ships, there would be no escape. Linux saw the realization in Scott's eyes, and a triumphant sneer crossed his face. You see, human, you have already lost. Your pathetic resistance will be swept aside, and the galaxy will tremble before Vulcan might. As the fresh Vulcan ships burned towards them, weapons already powering up, Scott knew he had only seconds to act. But against odds like these, what could one man, even a human, possibly do? He gripped his blade tighter, feeling the rage and desperation of 1,000 generations of humans fill his heart. The Vulcans thought them weak. They thought them inferior. But there was one thing the Vulcans could never understand about humanity. One thing that had carried them to the stars and beyond, that had let them claw their way to victory against impossible odds again and again throughout their history. Humans didn't know how to give up. Scott let loose a battle cry and charged, sparks flying as his blade crashed against Linux's. He would beat this arrogant warlord. He would save the colony below. He would show the galaxy what humanity was capable of. Or he would die trying. The battle raged as the Vulcan fleet approached, the fate of billions hanging in the balance. The Indomitable and its crew fought with desperate brilliance, outmatched but never outclassed. And on the bridge of the Kralnor, a human and a Vulcan clashed in a duel that would echo through the ages, neither knowing that the future of the galaxy itself might well be shaped by the outcome of their struggle. Scott stared Linux down, the Vulcan's face contorted with rage and disbelief. The human captain's voice was steel. "It's over, Linux. You've lost." Linux snarled, his grip tightening on his energy blade. "Lost? Foolish human, you've merely delayed the inevitable. My reinforcements will tear your pitiful ship apart." But Scott just smiled, a hard, predatory expression. "You still don't get it, do you? That EMP wasn't just to cripple your ships. It was a beacon." As if on cue, the sensor officer shouted over the din of sparking consoles and shorting circuits. "Captain, new contacts dropping out of warp. It's the human fleet." Linux whirled, his eyes widening as the viewscreen flared to life. Space rippled and tore as ship after human ship emerged from the ether, a vast armada of gleaming hulls and bristling guns. At their head was a massive dreadnought, its hull emblazoned with the crest of the human Admiral Graves. Scott's smile widened at Linux's stunned expression. "You thought you could ambush us, catch us alone and outgunned. But we were ready for you. Admiral Graves and the fleet have been waiting in the Oort cloud, just outside sensor range, waiting for my signal." On the viewscreen, the human fleet opened fire as one, a tsunami of missiles and beams converging on the surprised Vulcan reinforcements. The void lit up like a supernova as the two fleets clashed, the humans' advanced weaponry and stealth technology evening the odds against the Vulcans' superior numbers. Linux staggered back, his face ashen as he watched his reinforcements crumble under the onslaught. He turned back to Scott, eyes burning with unhinged fury. You think you've beaten me, human?" he hissed, talons tapping frantically at his wrist console. "If I cannot have victory, then I will have revenge." The Kralnor shuddered around them, klaxons blaring as the self-destruct countdown flared to life on every screen. Linux laughed, a sound of pure madness. "Die with me, human. Die knowing you have doomed your species to extinction." But Scott was already moving. He lunged forward, ignoring the burning pain as Linux's blade grazed his side. His armored fist crashed into the Vulcan's jaw, sending him reeling. Scott pounced, grappling with Linux as they rolled across the deck, a tangle of human strength and Vulcan fury. With a mighty heave, Scott pinned Linux to the deck, one hand around his throat, the other frantically working at the self-destruct controls. The seconds ticked down, the computer's calm voice a mocking counterpoint to the desperate struggle. 524-3. Scott's hand flew over the controls, his mind racing as he tried to remember his training, tried to find the shutdown sequence. 2-1. With a final desperate keystroke, the countdown froze, the numbers flashing once before disappearing. The Kralnor's engines powered down, its weapons falling silent. Scott sagged back, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Around him the human marines secured the bridge, training weapons on the stunned Vulcan crew. Linux lay pinned beneath him, his eyes burning with hate, even as the fight drained from his body. "Captain!" The comm officer's shout snapped Scott back to the present. "Incoming transmission from Admiral Graves." Scott staggered to his feet, wincing as his injuries made themselves known. He straightened his uniform, then nodded to the officer. On screen. The view screen flared to life, revealing the craggy, battle-scarred visage of Admiral Graves. The old warrior grinned, his eyes bright with triumph. "Captain Shaw, damn fine work out there, son, damn fine. The colony is safe and the Vulcan fleet is in full retreat. We've won the day." Scott allowed himself a small smile, but it quickly faded as he saw the Admiral's expression darken. "Sir, what's wrong?" Graves sighed, his shoulders slumping as if under a great weight. "I just received word from Earth Central Command. The Vulcan High Council has formally declared war on the human race. They're calling us upstarts and savages, vowing to wipe us from the face of the galaxy." Scott felt a chill run down his spine, a sense of foreboding settling in his gut. "What do we do, sir?" Graves' eyes hardened, a fire kindling in their depths. "We fight, Captain. We fight with everything we have for as long as we have to. The Vulcans think they can crush us, think they can break humanity's spirit, but they're about to learn just how wrong they are." He leaned forward, his gaze boring into Scott's. "Get your ship repaired and your crew patched up, Captain. You're going to be on the front lines of this war. Humanity needs heroes now more than ever, and I can think of no one better suited for the task than you and your crew." Scott nodded, a grim determination settling over him. "We won't let you down, Admiral. The Indomitable will be ready." As the transmission ended, and the bridge crew set about securing the Vulcan prisoners and seeing to the wounded, Scott stared out at the stars, watching the distant flashes of the retreating Vulcan ships. The battle may have been won, but the war was just beginning, and Scott knew with a certainty that settled in his bones that it would be a war unlike any humanity had ever seen. A war that would shake the very foundations of the galaxy. But as he looked around at his crew, at the determined faces of the men and women who had followed him into hell and back, Scott felt a flicker of hope amid the gathering darkness. Humanity would not go quietly into the night. They would not vanish without a fight. They would stand, they would struggle, and they would prevail. Scott Shaw stood on the bridge of his new command, the UES Defiant, as it sliced through the void. The ship was a marvel of human engineering, all sleek lines and thrumming power, built for the sole purpose of taking the fight to the Vulcans. And take the fight to them he would. The Vulcans thought they could crush humanity beneath their heel. They thought wrong. "Captain, we're approaching the target," his sensor officer reported, her voice tight with anticipation. "Vulcan supply depot, lightly guarded." Scott nodded, his eyes hard. "Bring us in, nice and quiet. Let's hit them before they even know we're here." The Defiant glided into the depot's sensor shadow, its advanced stealth tech rendering it all but invisible. On Scott's command, the ship powered up its weapons, target locks flashing across the displays. All batteries fire at will. The Defiant's guns erupted, lances of energy and missiles streaking towards the depot. Explosions blossomed in the void as the human weapons found their marks, tearing through the Vulcan shields like they were paper. But even as the depot crumbled under the onslaught, a new contact flashed on the sensors. A ship, Vulcan design, fast and deadly. Scott's blood ran cold as he recognized the profile. It was the Kralnor, Linux's ship. "Evasive maneuvers," Scott barked, bracing himself as the Defiant swerved, the Vulcan ship's opening salvo scorching past their hull. The comms crackled and a hated voice filled the bridge. "Captain Shaw, I had hoped I would be the one to end you." Scott snarled. "Linux, I thought you were rotting in a cell somewhere." The Vulcan laughed, a cruel sound. "Your prisons cannot hold me, human, and now I command the Vulcan Shadow Fleet. We are the blade in the dark, the ones who strike when you least expect it." The Kralnor surged forward, disruptor cannons blazing. The Defiant shuddered under the impact, alarms blaring across the bridge. "Shields at 60%. Scott gritted his teeth. "Return fire! Target their weapons!" The two ships danced a deadly waltz, weaving through the debris field of the shattered depot. Beams of searing light crisscrossed the void, each seeking to annihilate the other. "Captain, I've got a lock." Scott's head snapped around. It was Davis, his weapons officer and closest friend. The man's face was set in grim lines as his fingers flew over the console. "Take the shot!" A barrage of quantum torpedoes leapt from the Defiant's launch tubes, screaming towards the Kralnor. The Vulcan ship twisted, trying to evade, but it was too late. The torpedoes slammed home, explosions marching across the enemy ship's hull. But even as Scott allowed himself a moment of satisfaction, the Kralnor's guns swiveled, locking onto Davis's position. Time seemed to slow as Scott watched in horror, powerless to intervene. The disruptors fired, a searing lance of green light that pierced the Defiant's hull like a hot knife through butter. Davis barely had time to scream before he was vaporized, his console exploding in a shower of sparks and molten metal. "Davis!" Scott's cry was raw, anguished. His friend, his brother in arms, gone in an instant. The Kralnor, trailing smoke and debris, limped away, jumping to warp before the Defiant could finish it off. But Scott barely noticed, his eyes fixed on the blackened ruin of Davis's station. Something cold and hard settled in Scott's chest, a knot of rage and grief that threatened to consume him. Linux had taken his friend, and for that he would pay. No matter the cost, no matter what he had to do, Scott swore he would have his vengeance. In the weeks that followed, Scott threw himself into the war effort, with a fervor that bordered on madness. He pushed his crew to the limit, taking on missions that even hardened veterans balked at. The Defiant struck deep into Vulcan territory, hitting supply lines, shipyards, anything that would bleed the enemy. And they bled. Under Scott's relentless assault, the Vulcans began to falter, their advance slowing as they struggled to counter the human raids. But for every victory, the cost grew higher. Scott's crew bore the brunt of it. Injuries mounted as the captain pushed them harder, heedless of the risks. Whispers began to circulate, whispers that Scott had lost his way, that his thirst for vengeance had consumed him. But Scott didn't care. All that mattered was finding Linux, of making him pay for what he had done. Everything else was secondary. Even as the Defiant limped back to the human lines, battered and scarred from its latest foray, Scott was already planning his next move. He pored over intel reports, searching for any sign of the Kralnor, of his hated foe. And then a breakthrough. A massive Vulcan fleet, gathering on the outskirts of their home system, and at its heart, a familiar ship. The Kralnor, Lennox. Scott didn't hesitate. He ordered the Defiant to set course, ignoring the protests of his XO and the concerned looks from his bridge crew. They had a chance to end this, to cut the head off the serpent. He wouldn't let it slip away. As the Defiant approached the Vulcan staging ground, the scale of the enemy force became clear. Hundreds of ships from nimble fighters to massive dreadnoughts hung in space, a wall of guns and armor that seemed to stretch to infinity. The human fleet was already engaged, trading fire with the Vulcan vanguard. Explosions lit the void as ships died, human and Vulcan alike. It was chaos, death on a scale Scott had never seen. But he only had eyes for one ship. The Kralnor hung at the rear of the Vulcan formation, directing the battle like a maestro with a baton. Scott keyed the fleet comm. "This is Captain Shaw of the Defiant. I'm going after the Kralnor." A harsh voice crackled in response. "Negative, Defiant. Maintain formation. We need to punch through their center." But Scott was already accelerating, the Defiant's engines howling as he pushed them to the limit. His crew scrambled to battle stations, faces grim. They knew what was at stake. The Kralnor saw them coming. It peeled away from the Vulcan line, disruptors already glowing with deadly charge. Lennox's mocking voice filled the comms. "So predictable, Shaw. You let your emotions control you. It makes you weak." Scott bared his teeth in a feral grin. "We'll see about that." The two ships clashed like ancient gods, their weapons sending shockwaves through the void. The Defiant danced around the larger ship, peppering its shields with precision strikes. But the Kralnor gave as good as it got, its heavier guns scoring deep wounds on the human ship's hull. Consoles exploded across the Defiant's bridge as systems overloaded, the ship groaning under the strain. But Scott refused to yield, his hands flying over the controls as he pushed his battered ship to its limits and beyond. "Their shields are failing." Scott's eyes blazed with righteous fire. "All guns, target their bridge. Let's end this." The Defiant's weapons spoke as one, a concentrated barrage that slammed into the Kralnor's command tower. Explosions marched across the Vulcan ship's hull, atmosphere venting from a dozen breaches. And then, a final cataclysmic detonation as the Kralnor's reactor went critical. The ship disappeared in a blinding flash, a new sun blooming in the heart of the battle. Scott sagged back in his chair, exhaustion and grief warring on his face. It was over. Lennox was dead, the Vulcan fleet in disarray. They had won. But then a desperate cry from the sensor station. "Captain, I'm detecting a massive energy surge from the planet's surface. It's some kind of doomsday weapon." Scott's blood ran cold. Even in death, Lennox sought to claim one final victory. The weapon's power readings were off the scale, enough to vaporize the planet and every ship in orbit. There was no time to evacuate, no time to run. In that moment, Scott saw the path before him with crystal clarity. He knew what he had to do. "All hands, abandon ship, get to the escape pods." His voice was calm, resigned. His XO, a grizzled veteran named Mikhail, shook his head. "Captain, what about you?" Scott met his eyes, a sad smile on his lips. "Someone has to stay and fly her in. It's the only way." Mikhail looked like he wanted to argue, but the look in Scott's eyes stopped him. He simply nodded, clasping his captain's shoulder one last time before racing to oversee the evacuation. In moments, the Defiant was empty save for Scott. He sat in the command chair, watching the timer on the doomsday device tick down. With a thought, he activated the ship's comms, broadcasting on all frequencies. "This is Captain Scott Shaw of the UES Defiant. All human ships, withdraw to a safe distance." He paused, taking a shuddering breath. "It has been an honor serving with you all. Remember us. Remember what we fought for." With that, he cut the comms and gripped the helm controls. The Defiant surged forward, engines straining as Scott pointed her bow at the heart of the doomsday device's energy signature. As the ship hurtled towards its final destination, Scott's thoughts turned to his crew, to Davis, to all those who had fought and died in this terrible war. Their sacrifices would not be in vain. The Defiant struck the doomsday device like the fist of an angry god, the two erupting in a cataclysmic explosion that lit the void like a second sun. The shockwave washed over the planet and the battling fleets, sending ships tumbling like leaves in a gale. And then silence. The doomsday device was gone, destroyed by Scott's final selfless act. The Vulcan fleet, leaderless and demoralized, quickly surrendered, their fight gone out of them. In the days and weeks that followed, the story of Scott Shaw's sacrifice spread like wildfire. He became a legend, a symbol of humanity's indomitable will and unbreakable spirit. Memorials were raised, songs were sung, and children were taught his name as a reminder of the price of freedom. And though the war was over, Scott's legacy lived on. In every human heart, in every ship that sailed the stars, his memory burned bright, a guiding light for all those who would come after. For he had shown them the truth, that even in the darkest of times, even against the most impossible odds, humanity would never, ever give up. They would fight, they would endure, and they would prevail. Always. You have reached the end of the story. If you enjoyed this story and want to support us, please leave a like and subscribe to our channel, and for every comment that says 88, I will heart every single one of them. Thank you for your time.